Okay, so we have a functional monophonic synthesizer here that also has a graphical component to it, visualizing our sound as shapes. So there's a couple of things we want to do. Obviously, we want to encapsulate because this is a big mess. We also want to make this polyphonic, so we want to put this inside of a poly tilde. And there's 3 steps to that, really. The first step to creating a poly from a complex patch like this is encapsulation. So we'll encapsulate this, but we'll encapsulate it with a mind to eventually creating a poly. Once we've encapsulated it, tested that everything is working, then we will save our encapsulation as what's called an abstraction. An abstraction is a patcher that is saved to disk and then called back up by name without the P. So you just type in the file name with no P, and it calls the abstraction up. And the reason why an abstraction is useful is that you can then make multiple copies of that abstraction. And when you change the master file on your computer, every instance of that abstraction will update with the changes. So it's kind of like halfway between a patcher and a poly tilde. It gives you the ability to take a subpatch and use it in many places throughout your patch or in many different patches and projects. So let's get started with that. Let's take a look at what's going to go inside of our patcher with a thought to also what needs to be different for each instance of the poly that we're eventually going to make versus what needs to be the same, what needs to be global. So the thing that obviously needs to be different is the note itself. We're sending each note to a different instance of the poly so we can have polyphony. But all of the other settings are going to be global. Every voice will get the same filter LFO, amplitude LFO, pitch LFO, envelopes, etc. So let's start by just packing our note number and velocity. And then this is going to seem a little strange, but I'm going to connect that pack directly to an unpack so that our note number and velocity go where they need to go. And just keep in mind that this pack will be outside of our patcher, but this unpack will be inside of our patcher. So that's why we're connecting the pack and the unpack directly together. We can no longer use send and receive because they're going to be global, and we want them to be discrete. We want the individual voices to turn on. And everything else is going to be global. Move this over here. So, okay, that's important. This scale is going to be inside now. We want the pack to be outside. And then all of this stuff can be inside of our encapsulation. We'll leave the live.gain outside so that we have a master volume control for all of the voices. Our LFOs will be inside. Our ADSRs will be inside, but not the control of the ADSRs, which will remain outside the subpatch. This will go inside, as will the shape itself and the positioning. Our control for our filter will stay outside, but at a certain point we can put that inside, and then we'll just try it. We'll just do Command-Shift-E to encapsulate and see if that's clean. And it looks pretty good. We have our sound coming out here. We have our note going in here. We have our filter envelope, amplitude envelope, and filter range going in here. I think this is going to work, so we'll call this P synth voice. And again, this isn't a poly yet. This is just a patcher. We've just encapsulated. So let's go in here and set our settings, triangle wave, turn off our LFOs for the moment, and see if it's working. Set a filter range. And send the envelopes in. Working. Great. So So now we're going to need to drag out a couple of controls from in here. We're going to want to be able to control our pitch LFO from the outside. So we can do a receive pitch LFO. Unpack two floats. The first one will be the cycle. The second one will be the range. Copy that. Go out here and build a control for that. This is going to be a PAK pack because we don't know what order these values are coming in. LFO rate and LFO depth. And this is obviously the pitch LFO. And we can repeat this structure for our other LFOs. We have a filter LFO, call it filt LFO, and an amplitude LFO. So we've just taken the controls and put them outside of our patcher. And then we go back inside and hook them up. Do an R filt LFO to an unpack FF. Two floats. There's one, there's two. And our amp LFO, same thing, to an unpack FF. It's going to be an R amp LFO to unpack FF. And then the other thing we're going to want control of outside of our subpatch is going to be the amplitude of our four voices. So we could do our waves, unpack four floats, 1, 2, 3, 4. We also need resonance. Go back out and put those controls in. So resonance is just a single floating point value, but our waves are 4 floating point values. And our waves are saw, try, rect, noise. Saw, try, rect, and noise. Whoops. There it is. And we can tidy this up a bit. So here's our filter control, here's our LFOs, here's our waveforms. Let's test it out. Triangle wave, Filter from there to there with a resonance of 0.9. Try different envelopes. Okay, things are working. Let's try the pitch. Yep, that's working. Filter. I'm hearing it a little bit. Let's try more resonance. See if we can get it to sound more. There it is. Wow, 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 yeah. So we've got our basic structure set up here, and this is a good time to add a preset. And put into the preset everything that we want to save. And I like to make these patch chords a little less visible by taking them down to 10% opacity, approximately, black chords. Then they just become a little more hidden. And we can save a sound and save a different sound. One thing I realize also is that these envelopes won't be sent when they're recalled, so we do need to add a bang here. When the preset is recalled, it will send the envelopes. And just to be safe, maybe we'll put a little delay there to make sure the preset has time to recall before it sends. Great. So this part works. We have control of all of the elements of our synthesizer voice from outside of the patcher. We have a preset so that we can save our settings and recall them later. So our next step is to make this into an abstraction. And to do that, we simply do save as, and we'll save this as synthvoice.maxpat in the same folder as our patch. And now we can remove the P. And there's our synth voice. And we see it's a little bit different now. Down in the corner there's a pencil rather than a lock, because this is a separate saved patch. And we can edit it. We just have to specifically say now we want to modify that saved patch, and now we can unlock it and make changes to it. Let's make sure that still works. Yep, works fine. And the nice thing about this is this functions as a max object now. An abstraction functions wholly as a max object rather than as a patcher. So any change made to synth voice will be reflected in every instance of synth voice. And this is the way in which I say an abstraction is sort of halfway between a patcher and a poly. But we can take this all the way to poly simply by saying poly tilde synth voice 8. Now we have 8 copies of this poly tilde. But of course our connection's broke because we haven't set up this abstraction as a poly yet. So let's undo that. Let's change these to send and receives. Send amp envelope, send filth envelope, send filter depth, dive into our synth voice, click the pencil tool, then unlock. Now we're editing. We want to receive filter depth, replacing inlet 4. So no more inlet 4. We want to receive amp envelope, replacing inlet 3. Receive filter envelope, replacing inlet 2. Since this is going to be a poly, our inlets have to be in 1 and out 1. And in fact, we don't even need out 1. We can just do send mono out. And this can even be a send tilde, since it's sound. Send tilde mono out. Save this, close it. Now we're just doing receive tilde mono out to get our sound out. Like so. And this is now, we'll try it again, poly tilde synth voice 8. And now it has an inlet, no outlets. And let's test it and see if it works. It's not going to work fully, I'll just tell you, because there's further steps to this, but let's just see if we can get a sound out of it. Yep, we got sounds. That's great. So what steps are missing? Well, we want the poly tilde to be smart about which voices are currently used, because once we enter polyphonic mode, if we're playing 3 notes at the same time, the poly needs to know, okay, instances 1, 2, and 3 are playing, and instances 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 are available to be played. And there's structures built into poly tilde that help us do that. The first one is the MIDI note message. This instructs the poly tilde that what it's receiving is a MIDI note. And then the poly tilde responds appropriately, saying, okay, this is a MIDI note, so I want it to play one of my voices. And then inside the poly tilde, we need the this poly object. And this poly has a couple functions. When you bang it, it reports its voice number, and that's useful. That way when you open the poly, you can tell which voice you're seeing. But more importantly than that, it connects to your amplitude ADSR so that this voice is marked as active while it's playing and then marked as available when it's done. And I believe those are the only steps necessary. Let's save it and take a look. And anytime you modify poly patch, you need to reinstantiate the poly. You can do it by typing a space at the end and hitting return. You can do it by retyping the 8 and hitting return. It will reload the poly. So let's see if we're getting polyphony now. Need to send it a preset. So we have a functional polyphonic synth that gives us multiple copies of each sound. Let's just take something a little bit more geared towards polyphony here. Very nice, polyphonic synth. So what's the next step from here? Well, the next step is to decide, okay, maybe I don't want all of this stuff to be global. Like, what if I wanted my filter LFO to be per voice? If I wanted to be able to have a different filter LFO per voice. Well, I could keep this global control here and call it filter LFO global. But I could also put an inlet in for my filter. We'll say into is also going to control my filter LFO. Save that. Don't forget to reinstantiate the poly tilde and see our second inlet appears. So now we can have just tidying a bit. We can have a filter LFO local. And we can say target $1. Put an integer number here because our voices are integers. Voice 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And we'll play a note. Got to reload it. There we go. And we'll take one of these voices, voice number 1, and give it alone an LFO. Take a different voice and give it a different LFO. And another one, and a different LFO. Now, of course, it's hard to know what voice number is actually playing. So we can go here to this poly and when a note is played, we'll change this to a message box. Whenever a note is played, it will report that's the voice that's now being played. So when the note is turned on, send its number to S now. We edited the poly, so reinstantiate the poly. And we'll do R now. And play a note. That's note number 1 playing. So if we want to target that note with some effect, we target 1. And now we play a new note, and that's note number 2. So we can target note number 2 and affect it. Play another note. That's note number 3. So we say target 3. And we can do that with any of the controls. We can make them global and or local. So that's again, this is still the beginning. This is not the ending point. We just got a functional polyphonic synth. Now you start to play with it and get the exact behavior out of it that you want to.